Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends of the Leo Baeck Institute. My name is Markus Krah. I'm the Executive Director of the Leo Baeck Institute here in New York, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all, those of you who are here in person at the Center for Jewish History, and those of you watching us online on the live stream, to the 65th Annual Leo Baeck Memorial Lecture. And I want to welcome our distinguished speaker tonight, Professor Hillel Kieval, who will be introduced in a moment by Professor Marsha Rosenblit, the chair of the Leo Baeck Institute's Academic Advisory Council. The Leo Baeck Memorial Lecture was endowed by the late Marianne Dreyfus and her family, who are descendants of Leo Baeck. So I want to extend a particular warm welcome to members of the family, the Dreyfus family, who I think are not with us tonight here, but who I know follow this lecture on the live stream from Chicago. Thank you so much for making possible what is always a highlight of LBI's annual program. Rightly so, as it reflects the mission and the work of our institute over the past almost 70 years. The Leo Baeck Institute was founded in 1955 to preserve the history and culture of German-speaking Jewry, which very much includes a certain Jewish employee of the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute for the Kingdom of Bohemia in Prague, who found time to write in German what would turn out to be world literature. So we pay particular attention to Franz Kafka this year, 100 years after his death. The Kafka year is properly marked by our lecture tonight. I am glad that Professor Kieval promises in his lecture to show the relevance of Kafka for us today, because this is what we also try to do at the Leo Baeck Institute. We preserve the history and culture of German-speaking Jews over 1700 years. We do that by our unmatched collections of family papers, objects, and other material reflecting this history, much of which is digitally available to everybody who has an internet connection. So we are rapidly approaching the 5th millionth digitized page of our papers. I invite you all to explore this by going onto our website, where you can also find information about the public programs we sponsor, because in addition to preserving this history in its own right, we also promote the understanding of its relevance for the questions we are facing today. And you can imagine what these are. Sadly, they include anti-Semitism, they include exclusion, forced migration, but they also include issues of resilience, cultural expressions in the face of anguish, and other experiences which we bring to broader audiences in various ways. We have a book club, we have a very successful podcast, we sponsor exhibitions, and in many other ways, to all of which you are invited. Tonight, however, we highlight LBI's commitment to scholarship, which we also support by fellowships and by making our other resources available to scholars, and by inviting outstanding scholars to present their work, their research to our audience. Our Board of Trustees unanimously followed the unanimous recommendation of our Academic Advisory Board to invite Professor Hillel Kieval to do this tonight. And I now invite Marsha Rosenblit, Professor of Jewish History at the University of Maryland, and herself, an eminent scholar of Habsburg Jewish history, to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you all for coming, and I hope we will have an inspiring evening. Thank you.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Hillel Kieval this evening. He's my friend, he's my colleague, he's a fellow historian of the Jews of the Habsburg monarchy. In his case, the Jews of the Bohemian lands, in my case, Vienna and other German-speaking regions. For many years, Professor Kieval taught Jewish history at Washington University in St. Louis. He was the Gloria Goldstein Professor of Jewish History and Thought there. And before that, he was at the University of Washington in Seattle. But what I'd really like to talk about is not where he's taught, but rather his scholarship, because he is a great historian of the Jews in the modern era, in Europe, especially in Habsburg, Central Europe. His first book was The Making of Czech Jewry, National Conflict and Jewish Society in Bohemia, 1870 to 1918, came out in 1988. This was a deeply revisionist work that showed that the Jews of Bohemia, who had modernized through German language starting in the late 18th century, decisively and authentically turned to the Czech language, Czech culture, and Czech loyalty at the end of the 19th century. Those Jews were always bilingual, and to use his words, they flexed their ambidextrous limbs, unquote, and they joined with the Czechs in a region that was 2/3 Czech-speaking and 1/3 German-speaking, and with a significant Czech national movement. Others previously, of course, had noticed that Jews had done that they had, on the census, indicated, for example, that they spoke Czech, but they claimed it was opportunistic. It was Kieval's contribution to say, no, it was genuine. As Jews from smaller towns who mostly spoke Czech and received a Czech education and embraced Czechness, moved to the larger cities and to Prague. Not everybody agreed with Kieval, but his point has definitely come to represent the consensus about the Jews in Bohemia. He also, in that book, showed the significance of the growing Zionist movement, as some Jews rejected both German and Czech assimilation in favor of Jewish nationalism. And finally, he showed how all Jews coped with anti-Semitism, which was unfortunately not uncommon in the Czech national movement and in the German national movement in the region. So it was a really important book. His next book, Languages of Community, The Jewish Experience in the Czech Lands, which came out in 2000, was a collection of his very important articles on the Jews in the Bohemian lands, including really interesting work on Jews in early 19th century Bohemia and why German Jews had successfully Germanized there, why Germanization was successful in Bohemia, whereas it was not so successful in other regions of the Habsburg monarchy like Galicia and Hungary. And there were many important articles in that, including one very interesting article on the Jewish relationship with Thomas Masaryk, the first president of Czechoslovakia. In addition to that, along with the Czech historian Katarzyna Čapková, I hope I pronounced it right, he edited Prague and Beyond, Jews in the Bohemian Lands, which came out in 2021 in English, but it had first appeared in Czech, and it also appeared in German. I love the German title, by the way. It's from Zwischen Prague und Nikolsberg, the Jews of the Bohemian Lands. And this book showed how deeply embedded in the Czech landscape Jews certainly were. Most recently, Kieval has published a masterful study of late 19th century ritual murder cases, 2 in Austria-Hungary and 2 in Germany. And this book is entitled Blood Inscriptions, Science, Modernity, and Ritual Murder at Europe's Fin de siècle. It came out in 2022, just 2 years ago. And he looks at the ritual murder cases of Tisa Eslar in Hungary in 1881, 82, 83, in Xanten, Germany in 1891, 92, in Polna, in Bohemia, in 1899 to 1900, and in Könitz in Germany, now in Poland, between 1900 and 1902, to understand the modernity and the significance of these cases. And now he's working, in his retirement, he's working on yet another book, which I think will be very important, as his others are. It's called The Political Life of a Sacred Text, The Talmud, Citizenship, and Jewish Identity in Modern Europe. Wow, I'm waiting to hear about that book. But it shows his enormous range and his willingness to tackle really big and important topics. Tonight's lecture takes us back to Habsburg Bohemia and to things Czech, I suppose, and German, to explore a very complicated figure, the great German writer, Franz Kafka, who was born and lived in Prague, who spoke fluent Czech, but who lived in a primarily German-speaking world and was close to the circles of Prague Zionists. But he'll tell us all about that. I don't want to tell you what he's going to say, because I don't know what he's going to say. His title is wonderful. It's Still Reading Kafka on Language, Literature, Friendship, and Identity in Central Europe. I give you Hillel Kieval.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here tonight to speak to you. Can you all hear? Am I good? All right. As we heard a little while ago, this year marks the 100th anniversary of the death of Franz Kafka. An appropriate time, it seems to me, to think about this great writer again, to read him still, if you will. My modest proposal for this evening is to focus a historical lens on his life and work, his wider context, as well as his singular way of reading that context, in hopes of finding the keys to what it may have meant to be Jewish and Bohemian, a citizen of Austria-Hungary and Czechoslovakia, a unique personality, and one with deep social connections in the early 20th century. How, in other words, did Kafka read his own environment, its linguistic and cultural complexities, its ethnic conflicts, the place of Jews in its history, and in the Prague of his own time? What were his own commitments to family, friends, work, politics, and the state? How did he read and confront his own Jewishness? Did he have anything original to say about Judaism or Jewish identity? And finally, what might we take away from our own reading of Kafka? Why does he speak to us today? In his family history, his everyday life, and the strategic choices made by his parents regarding such things as migration, domicile, and their son's education, Franz Kafka was both a product and an exemplar of the Jewish experience in the Bohemian lands. Indeed, his life story is so deeply embedded in that historical experience that in this regard, he can be said to have led a perfectly normal life. Like most Prague Jews of his generation, Kafka belonged to a cohort that was the first to actually have been born in the capital city. Their parents had all been outsiders, migrating to Prague from the countryside after 1848, typically from villages where Jewish families made up a small fraction of the population and were well integrated into their environment. The father, Hermann, hailed from the small village of Osek in southern Bohemia, which had a total population of a little over 400 in 1869, the majority of whom were Czech-speaking. This meant that he was effectively bilingual, speaking German to local officials and perhaps in the synagogue, but whose daily interactions in Osek were conducted for the most part in Czech. Kafka's mother, Julia, née Lervy, was born to a well-to-do family of haberdashers and brewers in Poděbrady, which was a spa town in central Bohemia with a population of a little under 5,000, but with a very small Jewish population for reasons I can explain. The town was also predominantly Jewish Czech-speaking, and as I said, had few Jewish families, so few in fact, that there was no German Jewish school for Julia to go to as a young girl. So if she attended school outside the home, it would have also been conducted in Czech. Following the revolutions of 1848, the abolition of long-standing restrictions on the right of Jews to marry or to settle in certain cities and towns in Bohemia and Moravia set in motion wide-scale Jewish migration from the small towns and villages of the countryside to smaller and larger urban centers in Bohemia and Moravia, including such well-known places as Brno, Brünn, and Prague, as well as a modest boom in population. Both Hermann and Julia took advantage of these newfound freedoms in their 20s to make their separate ways to the Bohemian capital. They married in 1882, settled and opened a haberdashery in Prague's Staré Město, or Altstadt, close to the former Jewish ghetto, had their first child, Franz, in 1883, purposefully enrolled him in elite and largely Jewish German language public schools, so meaning primary school and gymnasium, in the Altstadt, close to home and work. They moved 2 or 3 times, always within the center of Prague, and even managed to enlarge and move their store to the ground floor of the Baroque Kinsky Palace in Old Town Square, above which stood the Altstädter Gymnasium, which their son attended for 8 years, from 1893 to 1901. Pardon. Young Franz, it seems, carried something of his parents' national ambiguity with him to elementary school, at least for the first 2 years, 1889 to 91. The usual practice at the German Volks- und Bürgerschule in the Fleischmarktgasse, Masna, was for the instructor to indicate a, quote, mother tongue for each student in the class register. Yet for about 10% of the students in his first-year class, Kafka included, the teacher failed to indicate a Muttersprache. The space by their name was left blank. It's not clear why, since the teacher also had the option of writing down something else, like German/Czech or Czech/German, but did not. Apparently unsure of exactly where young Kafka fit. In any event, as Ingrid Stör has indicated in her study of bilingualism in Prague during this time, all the students who lacked a specific language, notation, undoubtedly knew both Czech, German, and Czech. In Kafka's second year at the school, only 2 students lacked this language indication, Kafka and 1 other boy. By his 3rd year, Kafka's language is clearly recorded as German. Perhaps one shouldn't put too much weight on this absence of a household language indicator, but it does suggest that there was something of a multilingual environment in the family home, and a resistance on the part of the parents to be pinned down to a public identification with a single language, despite growing political pressure to do so. As it turns out, our young student displayed talent in both languages, earning an A+ in each in grade 3, for example, which was, so I read, an uncommon feat. And Kafka's engagement with Czech would continue throughout his schooling, as he was one of only 3 students in the Altstädter Gymnasium who took Czech for all 8 years. In recent years, scholars have debated the extent of Kafka's bilingualism and his command of the Czech language. Did he speak and write flawless Czech, they ask? Probably not. It seems that there were spelling and grammatical mistakes in the Czech documents, letters, and reports that he left behind. I shudder to think what later historians might think of my own term papers and emails in English. But the historical record is actually much more extensive than school records and report cards. And here are some things that we know. Kafka undoubtedly heard both Czech and German, as well as Yiddish-inflected German, in his home as a child. The family governess spoke to the children in Czech, and she, as it turns out, was Jewish and from the countryside. As a young adult, Kafka was sometimes called upon by his parents to negotiate with or to calm the workers in the shop. In what language did he speak with them, I wonder? And for 14 years, from 1908 to 1922, Kafka worked at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute for the Kingdom of Bohemia, eventually rising to the position of senior secretary, and this under the First Czechoslovak Republic. Many of his reports, memoranda, and correspondence from his time at the Institute are housed in the Czech Literary Archives, and they show pretty clearly that much of this material was produced in Czech. Okay, but were there German first drafts that preceded them? Did friends proofread them before they were submitted in final form? Possibly, but there's more. Kafka's youngest sister, Otla, married a man named Josef David, a Czech Catholic. Kafka spent parts of several summers with Otla and Josef in the country, and his written correspondence with the couple was often carried out in Czech. More intriguing still, at the close of the First World War and into the early 1920s, Kafka carried on an intense correspondence with the Czech writer Milena Jesenská, who was living in Vienna at the time and married to Ernst Polák, a Jewish literary critic. The correspondence began in 1919 at Jesenská's instigation because she wanted permission to translate his story, The Stoker, into Czech. When Kafka received in the mail a partial manuscript of her translation, he immediately wrote back. These are his words. Certainly I understand Czech. I've meant to ask you several times why you don't ever write to me in Czech. I'm not suggesting that you don't master German. Most of the time you master it surprisingly well. And if once in a while you don't, it bows before you of its own accord. And this is particularly pleasing. But I wanted to read you in Czech because it is part of you, because only there is the whole Milena. So, Czech, please. Not Czech, please, but Czech, please. Shortly thereafter, Kafka wrote to Milena with these words, I have never lived among German people. German is my mother tongue and therefore natural to me, but Czech feels to me far more intimate, which is why your letter dispels many an uncertainty. He liked her. I see you clearer, the movements of your body, your hands, so quick, so determined. It's almost a meeting. Although when I try to raise my eyes to your face, then in the flow of the letter, what a story. Fire breaks out, and I see nothing but fire. We can point then to Franz Kafka's family background, his years-long study of Czech language and literature, and select friendships with Czech writers as having been central to his development as a nationally ambiguous subject of the Habsburg monarchy and later citizen of the First Czechoslovak Republic. The kind of person, like so many in that country, who could not be pinned down to a single cultural identity. If this is so, how was his Jewish identity formed? By what means and to what extent was he educated in things Jewish? And how did his Jewish identity connect to his other cultural positions? Some information comes to us from the controversial letter to his father, from 1919, a revenge text, if ever there was one, in which Kafka describes his parents' Jewish practice and synagogue attendance as minimal, rudimentary, and frankly, hypocritical. Hermann attended synagogue only on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, yet chided his son for not being more assiduous in his own attendance. We know that Franz Kafka did celebrate a bar mitzvah, announced in the newspapers as a confirmation, which required that he recite from memory the blessings over being called to the Torah, and perhaps also the maftir portion. But beyond this, and perhaps one later diary entry, he leaves little behind from his childhood about Jewish matters. We should bear in mind, however, that his public schooling was not devoid of Jewish learning. Religion was a required subject in the Habsburg primary and secondary schools, one for which Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish students attended separate classes. For all 8 years in which Kafka was a student at the Altstädter Gymnasium, classes in Jewish religion met for 2 hours a week, taught by Nathan Grün, a graduate of both the Pressburg Yeshiva and the University of Vienna, and long-term librarian of the Prague Jewish community. It may well be that the curriculum tended to be dull and repetitive, that Jewish students did not direct full attention to their lessons, and it is true that neither Kafka nor Shmuel Hugo Bergmann, his classmate at the Altstädter Gymnasium, ever mention Rabbi Grün in their letters or diaries. Both Grün, but Grün was a venerable scholar in his own right, an example of someone who managed to combine 19th century Wissenschaft with intensive rabbinic learning. Perhaps Shmuel Bergmann himself provided some of the Jewish knowledge that Kafka lacked. Bergmann had grown up in a more Jewishly observant household than Kafka's and had attended Prague's Talmud Torah. During his university years, he became an early leader of the student Zionist organization Bar Kokhba, establishing its long-standing commitment to the program of cultural Zionism. After his emigration to Palestine in 1920, which is quite early, Bergmann became professor of philosophy and then rector at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and was also a co-founder of Brit Shalom, which advocated the creation in Palestine of a binational state. The two maintained friendly relations throughout Kafka's life, although it seems that Bergmann sometimes played the role of foil to Kafka's skepticism and irony. In a diary entry at the very end of 1911, Kafka recalled debating the existence of God with Bergmann during their school days, quote, in a very Talmudic way, either found within or from him, while enjoying a leisurely stroll around the town hall tower in the old town square. Let me read you a little bit of his recollection. At the time, I liked to take up the theme found in a Christian magazine, in which a watch and the world and a watchmaker and God were compared with each other. And the existence of the watchmaker was supposed to prove that of God. In my opinion, I was able to refute that very well against Bergmann, even if this refutation wasn't really firmly rooted in me, and I first had to put it together like a puzzle for my use. To debate in a very Talmudic way, either found within me or imitated from him. This is a fascinating formulation for me. Does it mean that even in his youth, Kafka had some idea of rabbinic discourse, and that he deployed this style of argumentation to demolish proofs for the existence of God and torment his poor friend? Or did he come up with this metaphor in retrospect? The reminiscence occurs, as we are about to see, during a period in which Kafka was at the height of his deeply engrossing contact with Yiddish theater and East European Jewish culture. This engagement with Yiddish culture was so strong that I'm almost inclined to argue that Kafka's real Jewish education, or to put it another way, his education in Jewishness, began with the arrival in Prague of a Yiddish theater company from Lemberg, Lviv, in September 1911, when he was already 28 years old. The troupe was made up of both women and men, not all of whom were from Lemberg, by the way, and included both relatively obscure and better-known actors, one of whom was Yitzhak Lervi, 4 years Kafka's junior, who would become his close friend and teacher in all things East European. Lervi had been born to a wealthy Hasidic family in Warsaw and had trained and had received a traditional Talmudic education, but was drawn to the theater at a young age, something that was forbidden in his conservative milieu. By the time he was 20, he ran away from home to join a traveling Yiddish theater group. In Prague, the Lemberg company performed from late September 1911 to the end of January 1912. First at the Hotel Central on Hibernska Street, but moving quickly to the Café Savoy on Koziplatzek, in German the Ziegenplatz, where it put on the large majority of its performances. As it turns out, both languages were very close to Kafka's home in the Altstadt. It's difficult to say how exactly he came to know of the actor's presence in Prague. The diaries and letters do not allow for a clear picture. And by the time Kafka wrote to his close friend, Max Brod, about the theater company, happy at their good fortune at having selected for themselves a performance of the operetta Schulamis by Avram Goldfaden, it was already October 12th, and Kafka had been attending assiduously for at least a week. And Kafka didn't just attend a few performances. He showed up several times a week. Why? What was it that drew him to these performances, that pulled him in night after night for weeks on end? One thing is certain, it was not their artistic merit. His comments about the plays in his diary, and he wrote about them constantly during this period, make clear that he didn't keep returning for the quality of the acting or the production value. What was it then? Kafka doesn't really spell this out. It's clear that he was attracted to the actors as individuals and established friendships with some. He is careful to jot down the names of the plays that he watched and their playwrights, even if he gets a few names wrong. And the months-long relationship with Yitzhak Lervi is intense. Lervi's not just a friend, he's a teacher and confidant. To borrow an image from anthropology, he is the native informant and Kafka the ethnographer. But this does not fully capture the pedagogical side of the relationship. Lervi was Kafka's Rebbe, if you will, his tutor in Hasidism, in East European Jewish life, and in rabbinic narrative. One has to be careful not to miss Lervi's role in the transmission and information about the Talmud, its stories and personalities, and Polish Hasidic customs and beliefs. These appear in the diaries as Kafka reconstructs them in characteristically concise, pithy form, in sentences that often lack a predicate, just a proper noun, followed by a colon, Max, Lervi, and quite often, yesterday evening, Café Savoy, followed by the name of a play or an actor or a playwright. In these entries from 1911 and 1912, Kafka is reproducing from memory what his eyes have seen and his ears have heard and his mind imagines. These entries are the record of his sentimental education in things Jewish. The observations are often critical, but full of admiration and fascination for what he sees. He writes on October 5th of a female actor and her husband together playing slightly ridiculous synagogue servants. Quote, "I actually don't know what sort of people these are, whom she and her husband portray. If I wanted to explain them to someone without confessing my ignorance, I would find that I take them for community servants, for employees of the temple, notorious idlers with whom the community has come to terms. People who are Jews in an especially pure form, because they live only in their religion, but live it without effort, understanding, or misery." We learn from the diaries that Lervi was a yeshiva bocher until the age of 20, that he used to hang out with a group of young people of his age who met on Shabbat in a locked establishment where they could smoke and break Sabbath observance in other ways, all while wearing their Hasidic garb. We read of Lervi's explanation of the mikveh, the ritual bath. Kafka writes, "The woman comes here to purify herself of her period. The Torah scribe to purify himself of all sinful thoughts before writing the last sentence of a Torah portion." By November 1911, Kafka's father had rendered his verdict on Lervi. "He who lies down in bed with dogs gets up with bugs." The same month, Lervi wrote to his own father, quote, "When I come to Warsaw, I will walk among you in my European clothes, like a, quote, spider before your eyes, like a mourner among the bridegrooms." This, I believe, is a quote from late Isaiah. For me, some of the most fascinating entries reproduce Lervi's Talmudic narratives, which always seem to contain an element of transgression. Here's one from October 28th, 1911. Lervi, colon, "4 friends became great Talmud scholars in their old age, but each had a special fate. One went insane, one died. Rabbi Eliezer became a free thinker at the age of 40, and only the oldest of them, Akiva, who hadn't begun to study until the age of 40, attained complete knowledge. Eliezer's disciple was Rabbi Meir, a pious man, whose piety was so great that the free thinker's instruction did him no harm. He ate, as he said, the kernel of the nut, the shell he threw away. One Saturday, Eliezer went for a ride. Reb Meir followed on foot. It's interesting that he calls him Reb Meir. Reb Meir followed on foot, the Talmud in his hand, supposedly, walking only 2,000 paces, to be sure, for any farther is not permitted on Saturday. And this walk gave rise to a symbolic dialogue. "Come back to your people," said Reb Meir. Eliezer refused with a play on words. That's a long entry. This story may sound familiar to many of you. Familiar, but also garbled. What Lervi has done here, or is it perhaps Kafka, is to splice together bits of 2 separate but closely related rabbinic narratives, stories that are recorded in both the Palestinian and the Babylonian Talmuds. One, concerning 4 scholars who managed to enter the orchard, the Pardes, and look about, and the subsequent fates of each. And the other about the scandalous behaviors of a scholar who had become an apostate, a denier of Torah, and whom the rabbis labeled Acher, the other. Acher's given name was Elisha ben Avuya, but in Kafka's retelling, he carries the name Eliezer, most likely a conflation of Elisha ben Avuya and another rabbi, Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, who also was a controversial figure, but for other reasons. What stands out to me here is Kafka's interest in the free-thinking apostate rabbi and in the relationship between Elisha ben Avuya and his prize student, Rabbi Meir, who, despite the renegade rabbi's waywardness, continues to seek wisdom from his teacher while asking him constantly to repent. Here's how the Babylonian Talmud relates one such encounter. Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught, there was once an incident involving Acher, who was riding on a horse on Shabbat. And Rabbi Meir was walking behind him to learn Torah from him. After a while, Acher said to him, Meir, turn back, for I have already estimated and measured according to the steps of my horse that the Shabbat boundary ends here, and you may therefore venture no further. Rabbi Meir said to him, you too return to the correct path. He said to him, but have I not already told you that I've already heard behind the dividing curtain, return, rebellious children, except for Acher. This is from the tractate Chagiga. We can see in this Baraita the elements that may have engaged Kafka's imagination enough to want to remember it. However, imperfectly. The heretical rabbi, who continues to care about his prized student and is revered by him, and who, despite having broken with Jewish law, remains the subject of numerous Talmudic narratives. The implication that intellectual give and take is integral to, perhaps, the essence of Torah. And the role played by irony, playfulness, humor, plays on words in interpretive debate. To recapitulate, Elisha ben Avuya arrives at the house of study on Shabbat, riding a horse. Not to be deterred, Rabbi Meir follows him on foot to learn Torah from his teacher. And Acher, mindful of his student's well-being, warns him that he's about to cross the limit of possible travel on Shabbat, and thus should go back or return. Chazor is the command given in the Hebrew text. But the synonym, shuv, is present below the surface. Unable to resist a play on words, Rabbi Meir appeals to his master to do the same, to do teshuvah, to return. And the textual play continues. It's too late for that, Acher replies. I've already heard from the other side of the curtain, that is, the metaphorical curtain that conceals God from the world. Return, rebellious children, all except Acher. A few months after recounting the Elisha ben Avuya tale, so in January 1912, Kafka writes a long entry on the world of the yeshivot, Talmudic colleges in Poland and Russia. What he finds most interesting about them, and this probably won't surprise you, what he finds most interesting about them is that, quote, it is here of all places that apostate progress begins, unquote. How so? The yeshiva, he notes, is a gathering place for young men from different places, quote, who strive to get away from home, unquote. And since the supervision, he writes, since the supervision isn't very strict here, and the young people here are completely reliant on each other, and the most essential part of their education consists in studying together and explaining difficult passages to each other. Since furthermore, there is always only one or another of the forbidden progressive writings in the hands of an individual, while in the yeshiva, they're brought together from all sides and can be especially effective here because every possessor spreads not only the text, but also his own fervor. For all these reasons, in recent times, all progressive writers, politicians, journalists, and scholars have come out of these schools. This will not surprise a historian of Eastern European Jewry, but it's amazing to see it in Kafka's diary. So once again, study, knowledge, transgression, rebellion. Most of us know, I think, that Franz Kafka's novels, The Man Who Disappeared, The Trial, and The Castle, were published only after his death. And this against the express instructions that he gave to his close friend and literary executor, Max Brod. But parts of his novels, The Stoker, for example, and Before the Law, were published as standalone pieces during his lifetime. Before the Law, Vor dem Gesetz, which he sometimes referred to as the legend in his diaries, and sometimes as the doorkeeper story, gave him particular satisfaction. It first appeared in 1915, Before the Law. In 1915, in the Rosh Hashanah issue of the Prague Zionist newspaper Selbstwehr. You know it, I'm sure. Let me just refresh your memory a bit from the beginning and from the end. A man from the country comes to this doorkeeper and requests admittance to the law. But the doorkeeper says that he can't grant him admittance now. The man thinks it over and then asks if he'll be allowed to enter later. It's possible, says the doorkeeper, but not now. Since the gate to the law stands open, as always, and the doorkeeper steps aside, the man bends down to look through the gate into the interior. When the doorkeeper sees this, he laughs and says, "If you're so drawn to it, go ahead, try to enter, even though I've forbidden it. Bear this in mind. I'm powerful, and I'm only the lowest doorkeeper. From hall to hall, however, stand doorkeepers, each more powerful than the one before. The mere sight of the third is more than I can bear." And now something from the very end. Finally, his eyes grow dim, and he no longer knows whether it's really getting darker around him or if his eyes are merely deceiving him. And yet in the darkness, he now sees a radiance that streams forth inextinguishably from the door of the law. He doesn't have much longer to live now. Before he dies, everything he has experienced over the years coalesces in his mind into a single question. He has never asked the doorkeeper. He motions to him since he can no longer straighten his stiffening body. The doorkeeper has to bend down to him, for the difference in size between them has altered greatly to the man's disadvantage. "What do you want to know now?" asked the doorkeeper. "You're insatiable." "Everyone strives to reach the law," says the man. "How does it happen then that in all these years no one but me has requested admittance?" The doorkeeper sees that the man is nearing his end, and in order to reach his failing hearing, he roars at him, "No one else could gain admittance here, because this entrance was meant solely for you. I'm going to go and shut it now." In the trial, the legend occupies a critical place in the next to last chapter, titled "In the Cathedral." It's a homily delivered by a priest to a congregation of one, Joseph K. But unlike the version published in Selbstwehr, in the trial, it's immediately followed by pages of discussion back and forth between the priest and Joseph K., a commentary, if you will, to the story itself. Kafka, in fact, refers to it as, quote, "an exegesis or the exegesis of the legend," unquote, in a diary entry from December 1914. The priest had introduced the story with a short warning: "Don't deceive yourself. You're deceiving yourself about the court." This suggested to Joseph K. an obvious line of interpretation, and he immediately jumped in at the tale's conclusion. So, the doorkeeper deceived the man. Don't be too hasty, the priest shoots back. Don't accept another man's opinion unthinkingly. I've told you the story word for word, according to the text. It says nothing about deception. And with this, they were off and running for 8 more pages. Just a couple of examples from that. But it's clear, said Kay, and your initial interpretation was quite correct. The doorkeeper conveyed the crucial information only when it could no longer be of use to the man. He wasn't asked earlier, said the priest. And remember, he was only a doorkeeper and as such fulfilled his duty. What makes you think he fulfilled his duty? asked Kay. He didn't fulfill it. It may have been his duty to turn away anyone else, but he should have admitted this man for whom the entrance was meant. You don't have sufficient respect for the text and are changing the story, said the priest. The story contains 2 important statements by the doorkeeper concerning admittance to the law. One at the beginning and one at the end. The one passage says that he can't grant him admittance now. And the other, this entrance was meant solely for you. If a contradiction existed between these 2 statements, you would be right. And the doorkeeper would have deceived the man, but there is no contradiction. On the contrary, the first statement even implies the second. And he continues, the priest, the commentators tell us the correct understanding of a matter and misunderstanding of the matter are not mutually exclusive. Well, giving up, you know this story much better than I do and have known it for a longer time, said Kay. And then Kay said, so you think the man wasn't deceived? Don't misunderstand me, said the priest. I'm just pointing out the various opinions that exist on the matter. You mustn't pay too much attention to opinions. The text is immutable, and the opinions are often only an expression of despair over it. When I reread this text a few years ago, having assigned it for a course on the creation of modern Jewish culture in Central and Eastern Europe, my immediate thought was, this is a rabbinic discussion. I heard echoes from a range of Talmudic literature, not only from Agadah, but the whole pattern of rabbinic discourse, the close examination of wording, the calling into play of alternative readings and traditions, the frequent open-endedness of interpretation. In the jousting between Kay and the priest, I thought I heard Yitzhak Lervy's retelling of Talmudic lore. More drawn out, perhaps, more freewheeling. Full disclosure, for a day or two, I allowed myself to think that I had made an original discovery. The exegesis of 4 Dame Gazettes was nothing less than Kafka's experiment in mimesis, in imitating Talmudic discourse. But alas, I soon discovered that I had been upstaged. I was beaten to the punch. It turns out that Gershom Scholem, the great, so if you're going to have to be upstaged, you may as well be Gershom Scholem. No? It turns out that Gershom Scholem, the great historian of Jewish mysticism, had made pretty much the same observation in a letter of August 1st, 1931, to his friend Walter Benjamin, part of a prolonged debate and exchange of letters about how to interpret Kafka's writing. Scholem argues in this correspondence that Kafka's literary method is to contrast the concrete reality of everyday human existence with the ideal of absolute justice, or to put it in traditional Jewish terms, of divine judgment. At the core of his writing sits a single question: is absolute or divine justice possible? Turning his attention to, Turning his attention to the cathedral scene, in the trial, Scholem proceeds to demonstrate just how the method of exegesis used by both characters resembles Talmudic discourse. Okay. Scholem points out in a later in a later essay, he points to an even earlier precursor, I should say, to the 3rd century Christian scholar Origen and an anonymous member of the Rabbinic Academy in Caesarea. In his commentary to Psalms, Origen quotes this unnamed, quote, Hebrew scholar, unquote, as saying that, again, I quote, "The Holy Scriptures are like a large house with many, many rooms, and that outside each door lies a key. But it is not the right one. To find the right key that will open the doors, that is the great and arduous task." Well, how should we connect the disparate elements of tonight's talk? What does the child of migrants from the Bohemian countryside have to do with the young man keen to make certain of his ability to read and feel at home in his Czech environment? What does that person have to do with the obsessive visitor to the Yiddish theater productions in Prague? What does one of the 20th century's masters of German modernist prose have to do with the collector and recorder of Talmudic and Hasidic stories? Fortunately, Kafka has been considerate enough to leave some answers, or traces of answers, behind in his fiction, his diaries, and his correspondence. There is, for example, a well-known entry from December 25th, Christmas Day, 1911, in which Kafka writes about the similarities that he finds between Yiddish literature and Czech literature. And he offers one very suggestive reply. What I discern of contemporary Jewish literature in Warsaw through Lurvy, and of contemporary Czech literature through particular insight of my own, suggest that many advantages of literary work, the movement of spirits, the unified coherence of a national consciousness, that in outward life is often inactive and always splintering, the pride and support the nation receives through a literature for itself and in the face of the hostile surrounding world. This diary keeping of a nation, which is something completely different from historiography. The detailed spiritualization of the extensive public life are immediately of use. The restriction of the nation's attention to its own circle and the admission of the foreign only in reflection, the emergence of respect for those active in literature, the awakening of higher striving among the youth, the liveliness of such a literature is even greater than that of one rich in talent. Ooh. The creative and gratifying force of a literature, bad in its particulars, proves to be especially effective when deceased writers begin to be entered into the literary historical record. Their undeniable past and present effects become something so actual that it's interchangeable in their writings, Czech and Yiddish. Not coincidentally, this lengthy section is immediately followed in the diary by an equally long and fascinating ethnographic description of a circumcision ceremony, Brit Milah, in Russia. Quote, "In the whole apartment, wherever doors are found, palm-sized plaques printed with Kabbalistic signs are hung up to protect the mother from evil spirits in the time between the birth and the circumcision," unquote. This is Kafka at his introspective, somewhat disordered, humorous best, a master of modernist prose to whom Hasidic practices, Yiddish theater productions, and rabbinic narratives somehow speak, an observer who cherishes both modern Czech and Yiddish writing precisely because they are still young and immature. raw in talent, combative, struggling to find an appropriate style, form, and vocabulary, but especially because they reveal a, quote, unified coherence of a national consciousness, unquote. Because they express pride and support in the nation, quote, in the face of the hostile surrounding world. Because they are, in a true sense, this diary keeping of a nation. When the Lemberg Yiddish theater troupe decided in January 1912 to pack it up and leave Prague to begin touring again, Kafka sought to help them raise funds by organizing an evening of recitals of Yiddish literature by Yitzhak Lervi, which was to be held in the heart of German Jewish Prague, in the auditorium of the Jewish Town Hall. Kafka was a one-man impresario and booking agent. He wrote letters for the actors. He pleaded with Bar Kokhba to ask Zionist associations across Bohemia if they would like to host guest performances by the group, wrote the circular for the performance in Prague, had it printed, and placed ads in newspapers. I imagine he even paid to have the tickets printed. Finally, as the date of the performance neared, which was February 18th, 1912, Kafka wrote a short introductory lecture for the evening, the text of which still exists. It reveals Kafka again at his best, full of irony and humor, barely camouflaged criticism of his audience, self-abnegation, and hope. He says the following, this is how he begins. Before we come to the first poems by our Eastern Jewish poets, I should like, ladies and gentlemen, just to say something about how much more Yiddish you understand than you think. He teased the audience for being, quote, so frightened of Yiddish that one can almost see it in your faces, unquote. Relax, he urged. Quote, bear in mind that apart from what you know, there are active in yourselves forces and associations with forces that enable you to understand Yiddish intuitively. If you relax, you suddenly find yourselves in the midst of Yiddish. But once Yiddish has taken hold of you and moved you, and Yiddish is everything, the words, the Hasidic melody, the essential character of this East European Jewish actor himself, you will have forgotten your former reserve. Then you will come to feel the true unity of Yiddish, and so strongly that it will frighten you, yet it will no longer be fear of Yiddish, but of yourselves. But Yiddish instantly gives you a self-confidence that can stand up to this fear and is even stronger than it is. His last words, for we did not set out to punish you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kieval, for a wonderful lecture on a series of fascinating interconnected topics, ranging from Elisha Ben Abuya to Walter Benjamin, with Shmuel Hugo Bergmann and Scholem and Kafka in the middle of it all. I imagine this has generated a lot of thoughts and feedback and questions from many of you, so I'm happy that we'll have the opportunity to continue those conversations at the reception immediately following the lecture outside in the hall. But before we move from the intellectual nourishment to the more immediate physical nourishment, let me conclude the formal part of this evening by bestowing on you the highest scholarly honor which the Leo Baeck Institute has to award. So on behalf of Dr. David Marwell, President of the LBI and the Board of Trustees, I want to present to you the Moses Mendelssohn Award for your outstanding scholarship, which has advanced our understanding of Jewish culture in Central Europe, 21st of May, 2024. And with this, please join us all for a reception outside, and thank you all for coming. Marsha, do you want to join us upstage for one more picture, maybe? That would be great.
Do you want me to continue to hold this?
Yeah.